Hello and welcome to the recording for Chapter 3, Getting Started on Methane Abatement Regulations. Today we are joined with special guest, Mr. Gil Damon, who's lead research fellow at the Center for Law, Energy, and Environment at Berkeley Law. Gil was also one of our contributing authors for our Methane Abatement Handbook. So thank you for joining us, Gil.
Yeah, thank you.
Go to the next slide, please. As a reminder, this presentation tracks the Methane Abatement Handbook, which can be downloaded and viewed at the link below. And big thanks to our funder for this handbook, the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Energy Resources, as well as all the other institutional contributors. Gil is not going to get into all of the details for Chapter 3, so we do encourage you to take a look at Chapter 3 in the handbook for more details. And Gil, with that, I'll turn it over to you for an overview of Chapter 3.
Yeah, thanks, Priya. Well, thank you so much for tuning in, and excited to be here. What we'll talk just a little bit about here is a little bit about how this handbook came to be, and then in some of the key takeaways for Chapter 3. So the handbook was sponsored by the U.S. Department of State Bureau of Energy Resources, as Priya noted, and it was developed by a broad cross-section of folks representing different governments, NGOs, multilaterals, industry, and in my case, academia. So some of the key takeaways for Chapter 3, there's a lot of things that we can start to look at when we try to categorize methane regulations. So we're looking at prescriptive, performance, economic, and information regulations. And so in a lot of cases, what you'll see is that these are not mutually exclusive, and you can have regulatory regimes that have elements of all of them. Industry actors may be ready to take voluntary actions, and then in some cases, you'll have political climates where you can move ahead with more prescriptive or performance actions as well. So what is the difference between these things? Prescriptive measures directly require entities to do something or not to do something. These include things like leak detection and repair requirements, equipment standards, bans, moratoriums, all sorts of items that can be enforced often as a binary. You're going to do this or you're not going to do this. Performance measures, we're looking at performance standards. So, looking a little bit more flexibly and broadly at an action and trying to make sure that you're hitting a certain target in terms of emissions. This can be at a facility-wide scale. This can be for flare efficiency, all sorts of things across the spectrum of possible performances that you could measure. We can also look at economic measures. So, we want to apply fees, we want to introduce financial incentives, and there could be a range of incentives such as taxes on flaring, subsidies for improvements, all sorts of measures that could link to various carbon markets. So you've got a lot of options there. And then with information, what you're looking at is requirements that regulated entities must measure and report, right? So that's something where you say to the entity that they need to make public some information about their operations, and that can be used to encourage better performance as well. So here we've got just a little bit of a diagram that kind of drives that home. You see prescriptive information, economic, and performance, all at different scales here. So some of the considerations, we want to think about ease of implementation. We want to think about how prescriptive regulations can be, fairly straightforward, right? But, you may not get, in some cases, the same level of impact. In a lot of cases, you get a little bit less flexibility with prescriptive, and that's always worth keeping an eye on. Economic instruments can also be a lot more complex, particularly if they're relying on a broader carbon pricing scheme, international frameworks. There can be a lot more variables there as well. Different approaches can be more effective just depending on your circumstances. So, information-based regulations can be really good in a lot of places because they enable a level of visibility where markets can perhaps help operators perform better, but they're not inherently going to lead to their own reductions. And then just one note here, there is a need for high quality data, and that's always going to be an important consideration. In a lot of cases, a performance regulation is only going to be as good as the data that supports it. So prescriptive approaches, again, tend to be, fairly rigid. They can be limited to certain technology options that exist at a certain time. Often performance regulations are able to account for the progression of technology in ways that prescriptive cannot. One thing to think about too is that there are risk factors related to norms, dynamics, geopolitical shocks, all sorts of other things that need to be taken into account here as well. And I won't get into too much detail, but you can see some of those pros and cons are represented in this chart here. And that again is in chapter 3. And then when we want to assess existing laws and institutions, so a lot of countries already have policies that address or could address methane abatement in the oil and gas sector. I see this a lot in my work where we have jurisdictions, particularly at the subnational level, who have authority to do a lot, but sometimes are not using that authority entirely. And then we have, variation in the types of legal instruments and procedures and standards and all sorts of things that governments are actually able to achieve. Some countries may need to develop new regulations. They may need to develop new systems of authority even to develop methane abatement regulations. And then in some countries, there is inherent authority to protect national resources. And there could be a fairly broad system of beneficial use there. So we have one case study here that we'll talk about with Sri Lanka. The government of Sri Lanka is using oil field practices through their new system, our standards of operating procedures. And in Sri Lanka, what we see is that you have seismic surveys being employed. You have new authority established through the Petroleum Resources Act in 2021, and just a lot of development and a lot of progress moving towards methane abatement in Sri Lanka. And stakeholder engagement, this is always essential when we look at anything methane abatement across sectors, and particularly in the oil and gas sector. We do have private sector oil and gas operators. We have investors and stakeholders. There's associations, there's media, there's local communities. There's all sorts of folks across society who are going to have stake in the methane abatement regulation. Everyone from environmental justice communities to governments at different levels, all the way to leaders themselves. And then, of course, when we talk about leaders, we have the legislature and the parliament, ministries, regulatory agencies, and so forth. So leveraging voluntary action. So we talked just a little bit earlier about information regulations, and information regulations often do lead into voluntary action. So we've got countries with fewer resources that often have lower initial capacity, and they may want to promote voluntary actions in order to achieve methane abatement early on. There can be joint industry efforts to produce industry-specific guidelines and standards and codes. Many governments are actively considering all sorts of tools for methane abatement. And so, it's also worth considering the possibility that policy choices, of course, can have unintended consequences, but making sure that industry is involved early on to help develop and sort of develop policies that are realistic, but also to anticipate unintended consequences. So common approaches, there's a lot of different case studies. Now that we have the global methane pledge, countries all around the world are really taking the lead on methane abatement. And so we can learn from all sorts of jurisdictions: Canada, Colombia, Mexico, Nigeria, and the like. We've also got a lot of subnational jurisdictions. I work a lot with the state of California, the state of Colorado. There's a lot of leadership we're also seeing now at the subnational level. But most methane regulations do focus on prescriptive or information approaches. There is also a growing trend towards a focus on performance. Methane regulations can include LDAR, flaring and venting, standards for specific processes, as we already discussed. And project approval procedures can be really important, right? Taking projects on a case-by-case basis is something that regulators tend to do. And the effectiveness of other measures, we need to think also about how methane fits into our approach broadly to our climate policy, and there's lots of different monitoring, reporting, verification programs that are worth looking at. So with that, thank you so much for your attention and for beginning your methane abatement journey. If I or anyone from UC Berkeley can be of any help, please reach out. And thank you so much for your time.
Great. Thank you so much, Gil. And again, please take a look at the handbook chapter 3 for more details, as well as any of the subsequent recordings or the chapters in the handbook if you want to dive into any of the topics that Gil has covered in detail. Thanks again to our funder for the handbook and this technical assistance, the State Department Bureau of Energy Resources.